Well, once again, good morning, everybody. I hope you can all hear me in your preferred language. I'd like to acknowledge my dear friends here in this panel. It's a pleasure to moderate this panel with you, and this topic is of the utmost importance. We have been discussing the use of generative AI. I think throughout the event, we're going to talk about Hague and the different techniques that are used in this type of use of AI, and how does the citizen interact with generative AI, moving away from the parliamentary website to more interaction with a conversational model where the person can interact with legislative information. So our topic of this panel is building the basis for this discussion, for this event, on how we can use this type of technique to improve interaction with citizens and the understanding of the information, which is often technical, and that makes understanding more challenging. And before starting with the considerations and questions that I brought, I will pass it over very briefly to each one of our panelists so that you can introduce yourselves for a minute. Starting with Sara Fernandes from the Portugal Republic.
Muito bom dia.
Good morning.
Eu soube do convite ontem à noite.
Well, I was invited to be here last night, and I thank you for the opportunity of being here to share what we've been doing at the Portuguese Legislative. I'm responsible for the informatics department, and I'll talk about the security and cybersecurity aspect in this discussion, which is fundamental on the topic of AI. We need to talk about security. Otherwise, we're going to have a huge problem. And I'm responsible for the operational center of informatics security. And during COVID, I was remembering the years where I worked in the health sector and going through the pandemic and how dramatic this period was. So thank you for reminding us of these very bad times. And thank you for the invite. I'm excited for the discussion. Thank you, Sara, for your introduction. Daniel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Obrigado, Luís. Bom dia. That's the end of my Portuguese. It is such a pleasure. There we go. It is such a pleasure to be with all of you today. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so glad to be back here in Brasilia. Thank you to Danilo and everyone in the Senate for the invitation. So in the United States, I work in civil society. So my role is different than folks, of course, who serve inside the Parliament, although I've served inside the U.S. Congress and its Library of Congress and for members of the House and Senate. But for the last 15 years, I've helped coordinate the Congressional Data Coalition, which is the civil society analog to the Congressional Data Task Force. So just a bit of background. The U.S. Congress is a very balkanized, broken up entity where there is not a single person or entity that is in charge. And so one of the big problems or issues that we face is coordination, the sharing of information, sharing of data sets, understanding what is going on. And I played a significant role in helping to facilitate a collaborative working group to help share this information, which is called the Congressional Data Task Force, which is made up of internal and external stakeholders. And in addition to doing that, we also have found that if civil society builds technology on the outside, that de-risks the development for it being built on the inside. So we often will play this catalyzing role as well, where we build technology either in collaboration with or in advance of what the Congress does to make it easier for them to do the work that they're doing. And finally, because there are resource constraints, we often work with the appropriations process, the process by which these entities are funded, to both give them instructions on what they can do, but also to make sure that they're adequately resourced to do that work. You only wanted a minute, so I will stop there. Thank you.
You are just fine. Thank you. Muito obrigado, Daniel. Ludovic,
Thank you
você
very
gostaria
much.
de se
Daniel
apresentar aos
Ludovic,
colegas?
would you like to introduce yourself?
Obrigado, Luís. Bom dia. And like
Thank
my
you,
colleagues
Luís.
from the United States,
Bom
this is
dia.
my limit in
Okay,
Portuguese.
this is my
I'm
lesson
very glad
Portuguese.
to be here today, and that's a real pleasure to come back in Brasilia for the fourth time, I think. Always a huge pleasure to be with the colleagues, both from the Chamber and from the Senate. And I would like to thank you very much for the Federal Senate for inviting us and having the opportunity to exchange today. My name is Ludovic Delepine. I'm from the European Parliament. I'm the head of the IT Governance and Enterprise Architecture Unit that falls under with the responsibility of AI governance. And I'm also involved in interparliamentary cooperations through a certain number of cooperation groups, among which the IT Governance Hub from the Interparliamentary Union that I share since 8 years. But I'm also more recently being the chairman of the European Union Parliament with a stream on artificial intelligence that was created a few weeks ago. So that will be a little bit related to the current topic. And I'm very glad if I can bring also my very old knowledge from old professor of AI from the last century in French universities and participate in this group. So that's a real pleasure to see you again and to meet colleagues and friends within this panel.
Merci beaucoup. Muito obrigado, Ludovic, pela sua participação.
Thank you,
por estar
Ludovic,
conosco
for
aqui
your
em Brasília.
participation,
Primeira
for
vez
being
no
here in
Federal,
Brasilia.
então,
It's the first time in the Federal
muito obrigado.
Senate, so
Agora a
thank
gente
you
acho
very
que vai para
much.
a sessão
Now
de
we
volta ao
will
português.
go
João Lima,
back to
se apresenta aos
Portuguese with
colegas, João.
João Lima,
Bom dia a
please.
todos. Meu nome é João
Good
Lima.
morning. My name is João
Agradecer
Lima.
à Bússola Tech, à
I would like
OEA,
to thank Bússola
pela
Tech
organização do evento. É
and
prazer
the
recebê-los em Brasília.
OAS. It's a pleasure to receive you here in
Eu trabalho no
Brasilia.
Senado
I work in
há
the
30
Senate
anos
for over 30
e há 20
years,
anos atrás eu
and
passei
20 years
ano
ago,
sendo orientado pela professora
I was one year,
Noronha.
and
Ano muito
I was being
proveitoso,
guided by Professor Palmerani,
onde aprendemos
and it was very
com o professor
productive,
Fábio Vitali também
where
como
we
estruturar
learned
a
with Professor
informação
Paulo
legislativa
Vitali
e jurídica.
in how to
Então, nesses
structure
últimos 20
information for
anos, trabalhamos nisso, professora.
judicial branches.
E os frutos estamos
And
colhendo
it
agora.
worked out, and the
A IA
fruits are
generativa
coming
precisa
now.
da informação
Generative
estruturada.
AI
Então, lhe agradeço
needs structured information.
por essa
So I thank
apoio
you
dado ao
for
Brasil
this support
em
to
todos esses
Brazil
anos.
all over these
Então,
years, from all
a
these
equipe do
years. Sorry.
Senado
So the team here in the
muito
Senate
boa nessa
is very good
aplicação da IA
in
generativa, né? Tanto
applying
para
the
sistemas mais
generative
simples
AI,
como mais
be it
complexos,
the
e isso
simple
iremos
or more
apresentar no
complex
painel
tasks.
seguinte.
And we will present
Não é
this in the
assunto desse
following
painel.
panel. It's not the
E
subject of this
agradecer então
panel.
a
And
oportunidade
I'd
de
like to
compartilhar
thank for the
pouco essa
opportunity
experiência
for
e
sharing this
aprender com
experience
vocês. Muito obrigado.
and to learn with you. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, João.
Thank you,
Bruno,
João.
você gostaria de
Bruno.
se apresentar aos colegas? Bruno Thomasi.
Bruno
Bom dia,
Thomasi.
pessoal.
Okay,
Meu
good
nome é
morning.
Bruno Thomasi,
My
eu sou da
name is Bruno
GovSys.
Thomasi. I'm from
Prazer estar aqui
GovSys.
hoje,
It's a
junto com o
pleasure to be
Luís
here
e a
at the
todos
invitation
pela
of
presença.
Luís.
A
Thank
gente
you
está
all
muito
for your
feliz
presence.
de
And
estar
we are
participando
very
no
happy
momento
to
que a gente
be
vê essa transformação da
participating in a
sociedade
moment where we
em
see the
torno da inteligência
transformation of
artificial.
society
A
in terms of
gente,
artificial
como empresa,
intelligence.
publicou
As a
ano
company,
passado
we
a primeira
published last
IA
year
legislativa
the
para
first
os
legislative
municípios.
AI
Então, a
for the
gente teve um certo
municipalities,
destaque
and we
por
had a
conta dessa
certain
ferramenta, mas a
highlight
gente
due
já
to this
está há 2
tool.
décadas
But
trabalhando com
we've been
tecnologia para
working for
legislativo.
2 decades
Então, é
with
um prazer hoje
legislative
trocar
tech.
ideias aqui
So it's a pleasure
para a
to
gente
be here
poder
to exchange
discutir essas
ideas
inovações
so we
das
can
quais a
discuss
gente
these
gosta muito de estar
innovations,
sempre
and
participando.
we
Então,
always
muito
like to
obrigado.
be participating. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Bruno, pela sua
Thank you,
apresentação.
Bruno, for your
Luís,
presentation.
eu vou começar com a primeira reflexão. Acho que eu trouxe
So I'll
pouco
start
disso
with the
tanto na
first
minha
thoughts
fala
here,
quanto
and I brought this in
como
my
moderador do
opening
painel.
speech and the panel opening.
Essa quebra paradigmática
This
que a gente está
breaking
vivendo
of the
agora com o uso da
paradigms
AI para
that we're seeing
informação
through
legislativa
AI
consumida.
and consumed legislative
A gente está
info.
saindo de um
We're
modelo, na
leaving
minha
from
visão,
a model,
que
in my view, that are static models of documents, PDFs, sites, databases. And now, with emergence and the democratization of the access to AI, where people with little or no training are able to use those tools, and this allows greater permeability in the use of this kind of platforms by society. So my question, starting with Daniel, which is it's your work for many years. How do we do this transition from a static information model where you have to seek information in a portal or from other parliaments into a format where you can dialogue with information, you can interact with information through a model like the ones we're going to discuss in this event, and how this requires from Parliament in terms of responsibility, design, and institutional capability of parliaments, in your case, the American Congress, to promote this kind of change. So 5 minutes, please.
So the most important part of that was 5 minutes, please. So I will watch the clock. I apologize for the background noise. Is that better? Okay. Sorry, it's getting feedback from my headphones. There we go. In the US context, I'm going to describe what's happening. So sort of what is and not what ought to be. I hope that's helpful. We're seeing real distinctions between what I think of as direct access to information through AI versus mediated access to that information through AI. In other words, through third parties. Many of the players in the US Congress are reluctant to make information directly available to the public through an AI. The concerns does not relate to AI specifically, although its ability to make up or to hallucinate can be a challenge. But it's the same long-standing concerns that have always existed, which is that members of Congress, and more importantly, the support offices and agencies, are concerned about people misunderstanding the information that they receive. And this can be both a sincere concern that they have, but also can be also may relate to access to information. Access to information changes the way that power operates. So that can be a concern for some of the players as well. Those concerns seem to be less so when the information is mediated, when it comes through some other entity. So that information is made available through an API or some other mechanism, and someone uses AI on top of that. There is still, of course, the concern that it will generate confusing or misleading information. So we see this in the context of summarizing legislation, where summarizing legislation is a skill. It is not something that a computer can do very well right now. But there are many, many people who are selling tools and technologies that try to summarize legislation. The way that the US Congress is working around some of this, where they want to work with AI on one hand, but they are also concerned on the other, is that they're trying to feed the information to these AI tools. So the Government Publishing Office, which is the folks that are responsible for printing information in the US Congress, just announced that they are providing their information through a model context protocol server, so that much of their data is going to be made available in a way that an AI can query against, just like it can for an API, just like it can for other technologies, but they're not going to try to contextualize it. One of the prompts for this conversation were questions around like chatbots. We are unlikely to see external facing chatbots anytime soon. But there are internal chatbots. There are internal chatbots to train staff on how to use tools. There's one agency is using Notebook LM to take their voluminous protocols and to create like radio conversations for staff to listen to. So you are seeing mediated or internal use of AI for some of these approaches. But in terms of the public-facing side, there is a lot of concern about people misunderstanding information. Like I said, that's driven both by legitimate fears, but it's also driven by efforts to control and shape the way information works. The result is that tools that Congress uses or third-party entities will be the ones that will be leading the charge for this more interactive model. And just one final point, because I'm trying to stay within your 5 minutes. I'm working on it. The AIs are being trained by sources of information that exist elsewhere, right? They are consuming tremendous amounts of information. And we know that Wikipedia and Reddit, strangely enough, are major sources for that information. So the extent to which Congress is or is not working to make its data publicly available en masse and for people to try to explain that information in ways that can be ingested by AI is sort of another link in this chain. It is not the direct making available of information, but it is making it available in places where the AI companies are trying to gather their data for the underlying training of their models. And that is something that is often overlooked, but it is also very interesting. And with that, how'd I do? Was that good? Excellent. Thank you.
Absolutely perfect. Muito obrigado, Daniel, pelas suas considerações.
Thank you, Daniel, for your
Ludovic,
considerations.
gostaria de
Ludovic,
comentar esse
would
tema
you
também?
like to comment this theme as well?
Thank you. Considering the difference between static and dialogical understanding for decades, parliaments have fulfilled their duty of transparency by making information available. So laws, amendments, reports, and debates were published online, and all these documents were accessible through portals and databases. But this model assumed that access equal understanding, and it often means exposure without meditation. So the emergence of generative AI and conversational interfaces profoundly changes this relationship. Legislative information is no longer only something citizens consult. It's something that they can question, explore, and interrogate. The relationship shifts from access to dialogue, from consultation to interpretation. And this change is absolutely not cosmetic. It alters how citizens position themselves vis-à-vis the institution. When a citizen asks a conversational system why this amendment was rejected, or how does this law affect my situation, they are not browsing a repository. They are engaging in a form of guided reasoning. The institution is no longer silent between documents, it becomes responsive. This new proximity carries responsibility. A conversational interface speaks with institutional authority, even when it is framed as an assistant. Citizens will naturally attribute meaning, intent, and legitimacy to its answer. This means parliaments must move from publishing information to creating meaning. From a design perspective, this requires a shift in mindset. These systems must be designed to explain, not to retrieve, to contextualize, not simplify away complexity, to expose uncertainty where it exists, rather than masking it behind fluency. A good conversational system for a parliament should be capable of saying, this is debated, this is contested, or this interpretation depends on the content. Institutional readiness is equally critical. A parliament cannot deploy a conversational AI as a technical add-on to an existing solution. It requires governance, editorial responsibility, and clear accountability. Who defines what the system can answer? Who validates its sources? Who monitors its outputs over time? These are institutional questions, not an IT question. Most importantly, parliaments must accept that dialogical access changes expectations. Citizens will expect responsiveness, coherence, and continuity. Meeting those expectations responsibly requires not only technology, but a mature institutional posture towards explanation, pedagogy, and listening.
Muito obrigado. Thank you, Ludovic, for your considerations. João, você gostaria de comentar sobre esse tema também?
João, would you like to comment on this?
Quero começar
So I
caso
would
que
like to
ilustra
start
o
with a
risco
case that illustrates
que
the
corremos
risk
nessa transição
that we
para o
have
modelo
in this
dialógico.
transition
Em
of the
2024,
dialogue
o
model.
Tribunal Canadense
In
decidiu o
2024,
caso
a
Moffat
Canadian
versus
court
Air Canada.
decided the Moffat versus Air Canada.
Jack Moffat precisava
Jack
viajar
Moffat
para o funeral
needed
da
to
avó.
travel to the funeral of his
Antes de comprar as
grandmother.
passagens, consultou o chatbot
Before
da
he
companhia
bought the
aérea
passages, he
para entender
consulted the
políticas,
chatbot
tarifas
of the
e
air company to understand tariffs for those who are grieving. Chatbot informed incorrectly that he could buy the tickets, and after the trip, he could reimburse it partially within 90 days. And trusting in this orientation, Moffat bought tickets, and when he tried to get reimbursement, he discovered that the real policy only allowed the discount before the flight, not afterwards. Moffat went to court, presenting the chatbot screenshots. The court rejected the argument of the company that the fault was of the AI. The decision was clear. The company is responsible for all the information in their site, be they static pages or chatbots. Air Canada was condemned to reimburse the difference plus court costs. Why do I bring the case of an air company on a panel on parliaments? Because it establishes a principle that is valid for any institution. Those who make available a chatbot are responsible for what it says. In the static model, the Parliament works as a library, making available the text of the law, the amendments, and the citizen has to do the interpretation of that. In contrast, in the dialogical model, the AI interface many times takes on the role of an interpreter. If the chatbot incorrectly tells the citizen about his rights, we cannot say that the bot is a separate entity. The responsibility will be ours because we offered the tool. And the challenge is greater because we live in the era of the regulating state. The correct answer is rarely in a single law. It depends on analysis of multiple sources, constitution, ordinary laws, decrees, regulation, jurisprudence. Let me give you an example in how we deal with this in a concrete situation without using generative AI. Here in the state, we have the service Speak with the Senate, operated by our ombudsman. We received 39,000 demands, over 30,000 per day. That's by the voice channel, and we had got 112 written letters. When the citizen calls asking about his retirement, those who pick it up do not try to apply a norm. That's not the role of Parliament. They tell him to look for our Social Security institution, an institution from the executive power that is responsible for that subject. Why? Because the answer depends on individual data, transition rules, contribution time, a normative network or web that is not up to the Senate to interpret for concrete cases. On the other hand, when it's a request on the right to retirement in a general form and not specific, we can offer something different. We register it so we can send it to the senators. We research law bills as regards the issue, and we orient the citizen on the possibility of registering a legislative idea in the e-citizenship portal for popular participation. So this distinction is fundamental. To orient and to direct is very differently from trying to apply the norm always. The citizen wants an AI that responds quickly in a correct form and with good basis. However, we have to have the humility and recognize that in certain situations, what we can offer is only a responsible AI, one that deals correctly with the demand, even if this means, in simple language, something like, "This question is not with me. I'll direct you to those who can help you in the best way." And here in the Senate, we formalize this prudence in the Act of the Director General 2825. Article 4 establishes the directive of human supervision and decision autonomy. The AI systems must have mechanisms that allow the review and human validation, guaranteeing that the users of the system keep their autonomy in taking decisions.
But the standard in and of itself is not enough. We need technical architecture. And this is the central point. There is no safe legislative AI without an orchestrator. An orchestrator is an intelligent leader that categorizes the nature of the citizen's manifestation before generating any answer. In our example, it identifies this question is about an individual situation, or this is a general manifestation. Without an orchestrator, AI would deal with all questions in the same way, and we would become the Air Canada of the public sector, an institution that trusted a machine too much. The institutional readiness that we defend is supported by three pillars: internal standards that are robust, architecture with an orchestrator, and as I will detail in the next rounds, the human mediation for validation. The Parliament in the 21st century cannot be scared of technology, but we also can't be naive.
Muito obrigado, João.
Thank you, João. I think you have introduced some of the topics that I will bring to our reflections in the next questions. Before we go to the next questions, I will pass it over to Bruno Thomasi for the considerations from the private sector. Well, it's hard to follow João because I was going to say many things he already said, but we understand that there's a total difference between what we had previously, which was transparency, basically the publishing of a document, which is still seen as transparency currently. The courts of accounts demand that type of transparency currently, the publishing of administrative and legislative documents in the transparency portals. But this, basically, even if it's in structured data and databases, but we tell the citizens that the information is available, and now it's up to you. Basically, they would have to understand everything that's published, and that's where we have problems, because the regular citizen doesn't have the technical knowledge on the legislative branch, and we want to communicate with them or to people who already act in the legislative sector. But for this, the public website wouldn't be necessary. The internal system would be enough. And a conversational interface, like João said, changes this premise, because the citizen doesn't need to be familiarized with the website or the vocabulary of the legislative branch. They can ask, was this project approved? And this automatically becomes an answer. So they don't need to seek out the answer, which often is a complex process of reaching the specific information. Who is the rapporteur of this project? This question may seem simple, but try and find this information on the website. It's not an easy task. So we need to understand how AI can help. It has its limitations, of course. We need to be very careful when it starts issuing opinions. That's where we have problems. What we see is that when we ask AI to answer questions, the Parliament will no longer be a data archive, but will become a mediator for the understanding of legislation. And that's when it becomes a risk. And like Luís said, actually, João Lima, you need to have a limit of what we're willing to risk. Are we willing to risk too much for it to give a easier answer, or should we wait for the advance of technology so that we don't run the risk of importing incorrect information and try and limit ourselves to what we're sure it won't get wrong, or that we have a very low error capacity? So, because even if I call here at the Senate, humans can get things wrong. They may share incorrect information. So zeroing the error rate is impossible both with humans and with machines. Humans also make mistakes, so we can't expect technology to get it right 100%. It will get things wrong and it's okay, but we need to be careful about what it gets wrong. That's the main point. What are we willing to risk? And I think we need to understand that what changes is the expectation that the citizen has. They're not just expecting for us to give them access to information. They want clarity. They don't want to just know if it's published. They want to understand. They want us to help them understand. And that's where the legislative branch can use these tools for AI to increase comprehension, which is the result that we want. We don't want to just publish a document to meet a legal demand. We want there to be understanding because this creates legitimacy in the legislative branch. It needs to have favorable public opinion. So we need to expand these channels to increase the understanding about what is done in the legislative so that this can improve the evaluation of the service provided by the legislative. Thank you very much, Bruno. Before passing it over to Sara Fernandes, something that you both brought up is not just about accuracy, but also about the lack of context for the information. An information can be perfectly correct, but out of context in time, or depending on the question or the topic, it may be out of context. And that's important when we're dealing not with the internal public that understands the functioning of the parliament, but here we're talking about a broader public that often doesn't know the details of how the legislative process works or how the parliament works. So we need to be careful, and we need to be very user-friendly. We need to be user-friendly and lead the user to find not only the right information, but also the information with the right context. Sara, would you like to make your comments?
Thank you. Obrigada. Eu acho que neste
Well,
momento
I think right now
já não há volta a dar ao uso ou não uso de inteligência
we
artificial.
are no longer talking about the
Tem que ficar
use
muito
or the
claro
non-use of AI.
E tem que ficar claro que nós
It needs to be clear that
ao longo dos anos
throughout the years we
muito aquilo que ia acontecer,
we have categorized many of the things that would happen in the public administration. We went from the whole of government and governance, and ever since 2011, there's a term that I think will be more and more used, which is whole of society. And I think AI is very related to this topic, the whole of society topic, and the way in which we use AI to foster this whole of society. In terms of the use of AI, the topic of our panel is generative AI, and we have large data models, LLMs, internal, on-prem, cloud-based, hybrid, doesn't matter. But the goal behind generative AI is to generate new information. And AI has some specificities, and I speak from the standpoint of someone who is getting my second doctorate on AI, and which is how we apply or how we introduce some topics like, for example, ethics in AI. For example,
because I have our American friend here, mas quando utilizamos
but when we use drones with AI in terrorist attacks, what happens is we have a terrorist located in a school, and the drone doesn't know that surrounding this terrorist, we have 50 children. The target is killing the terrorists. Ethics or common sense still doesn't exist in AI. Generative AI, and we need to be very clear on this, on how we use AI. We introduce information, data, and it generates answers. And we need to be careful and attentive to the answers that are generated. And practically everybody uses ChatGPT, and ChatGPT has something that I like to refer to as my mother. Whenever I ask my mother something, she never says that she doesn't know. There's always an answer, and ChatGPT is like that. It always has an answer. And when we use generative AI, there will always be an answer. Is that the answer we want? Is that the answer that's useful? And that's what we're discussing here in the legislative. And I can say one of the projects that we started last week is exactly not only have legislative ontologies available, but also have APIs and define our laws and group our laws by different sectors, by different ministries, so that we can say that within health, what were the discussions, and try and give some context to what's being discussed. And we have a platform in our channel for the Parliament, which is our entryway, where people can become informed about what is being discussed. And this needs to always be created and made available in a very controlled manner, so that we don't have what ChatGPT right now does, which is not just giving an answer, but always an opinion. And in the way that we're working, keeping in mind the whole of society, we need to be more careful and study more.
Muito obrigado, Sara, pelas
Thank you very much,
considerações.
Sarah, for your
Vou trazer a
considerations.
minha próxima
And
pergunta
my next
ao
question
Bruno,
will be
iniciando agora do outro lado da
first
mesa.
for Bruno, starting now on the other
Bruno, quando a
side
gente
of
está
the
falando
table
aqui,
here.
o tema, né, o uso da inteligência
Bruno, when
artificial,
we're
não
talking
apenas
about
da
the use
inteligência
of
artificial, mas da
AI,
inteligência
not just
artificial
AI,
generativa,
but generative AI
especificamente,
specifically,
para fazer o enable, né, para
to enable
possibilitar o engajamento
the
do cidadão com
engagement
informação
of
legislativa.
citizens with legislative
Como que os
information.
parlamentos
How
podem
does the
assegurar
Parliament
que essas ferramentas
make sure that
genuinamente
these
possam
tools
melhorar
can
a
genuinely
compreensão,
improve the
a
understanding,
confiança, que eu
the
acho que é a
confidence,
palavra
which I think
central quando essa
is
pergunta me veio na cabeça, como
the
que,
main word
mesmo
here?
acessando essa informação
How
através de uma
can,
interface que utiliza inteligência
even though the
artificial,
citizen
como
is
se
accessing
mantém
the
a
information through
confiabilidade daquela
an
informação
AI
que está
tool,
sendo
how can
recuperada,
we
e também
keep that
a participação
information
democrática,
trustworthy and
ao
also
invés de
democratic
introduzir
participation,
elementos
so
que
that
poderiam trazer mais
instead of
opacidade, poderiam
introducing
trazer
elements
a
that could make
inacurácia, né?
things more
Ou até
opaque
mesmo
or
uma
inaccurate,
desconexão
or
entre a
even
instituição e o
a
cidadão.
disconnection,
Então, acho que
bring a
aqui eu coloquei
disconnection
dois
between
extremos,
the
né?
institution and
lado
the
em que
citizen. So
é
here I
projeto
presented two
muito bem
extremes. On the
estruturado,
one hand, we have a
com
very
uma governança de
well-structured
dados forte,
process
com
with strong data
estruturação e feedback
governance, with the
forte também.
structuring
E do
of
outro
strong
lado, eu estou
feedback.
colocando
And on the other
algo que
hand,
não tem esses
I am
elementos
talking
de
about
governança.
something
Então,
that
eu
doesn't
queria trazer
have
essa reflexão
these
para você e
governance
perguntar
elements. I'd
como
like
que
to
você
bring
enxerga isso
this
aí nos
reflection to
parlamentos.
you and ask how you see this in parliaments.
Bom, eu acho que a maior
Well,
armadilha que
I
a gente
think the
acaba
biggest
tendo é
trap
achar
that
que
we have here
que
is
o risco,
thinking
da
that the
IA é
risk
técnico.
of
E é
AI
risco
is a technical
institucional, de
risk.
fato, né?
It
Porque a
is an
gente pode acabar
institutional
criando
risk
canal simpático,
because we may
eficiente, bonito, que
create
fale
a
bem,
an efficient, good-looking channel that answers quickly, but which is not connected to the truth. And this is the biggest problem, a digital oracle that creates sentences, but not confidence. And this can happen if it's not well configured. There are parliaments trying to implement solutions without a technical entity that knows what they're doing. So around the world, often parliaments go to the private initiatives. In Brazil, this is harder because of the process to have these tools that are in private institutions used in public institutions. There are institutions or modalities for hiring of private services that were just published for innovation here in Brazil. And I think that in due time, the public entities will start hiring the private initiative to implement solutions, bringing more know-how and swifter implementation, and definitely more accuracy in the results. So generative AI in the parliament is not a technology project, it's a legitimacy project. We need to be responsible. It can't be an automatic spokesperson that speaks with authority but without a source. And currently, ChatGPT cites sources in a reliable manner. Previously, it used to cite sources, but when you clicked on it, you wouldn't find the information. And now it mentions the link, and you can check the information at the source. And this needs to be implemented in our chatbots. We're developing a solution that currently is easy to implement because it uses the legislative system that has structured data. So the parliament that's currently implementing our generative chat solutions, it assumes that we have the structured data that makes it easier to interpret the information and not make mistakes. But when we have a parliament where nothing is structured, that's just becoming digital, the risk of mistakes is much higher because the data needs to be easy to access for AI with good labels, well structured. We currently use JSON, but we also have XML, and it understands structured data very well. But pulling data from parliaments that don't have structured systems to this new standard can become an issue. And what we have implemented is this. In addition to it saying, oh, the decision of the judiciary about this project decided on the approval of this project. And this is the link for you to check for yourself. This is something that makes it easier. You summarize what was decided, but the person can go to the source and look for the information. And this is something that de-risks the level of accountability of the parliament because it gives access to the original information. This does not eliminate the risk of the machine making mistakes, but it gives access to information from a source. So the traceability, in this sense, the citizen doesn't want the AI's opinion. They want the institution to talk to them. And in this sense, the official channels, which would be the link for the project, for the document, would be necessary. And for this, these documents need to be public. We have many subnational parliaments in Brazil that do not have the publishing of decisions in a clear and objective manner. They publish the initial text of the project, but everything that happens until it's approved is not public. So that makes it harder for AI to make comments. And if this project was amended, we're talking about a different project. So AI needs to understand that. And the design of the citizen's experience, as Luís mentioned, the user experience, we're trying to make it so that in the end, the chatbot makes a call to action. Would you like to follow up on the legislation? And it issues push notifications. And this AI is already integrated with our APIs. We're using MCP, which was what Daniel mentioned, that's used there. We currently use MCP connected to our AIs, and it's very interesting how smart it is, how these models have evolved. When you say, oh, I want to know about a bill number so-and-so, it detects the ID of the bill and it goes straight to the source. So I'm not working with hack. I'm working with a search directly in the API, and it was able to structure the data and extract it and directly from the system. So the chance of error is much smaller. I'm sorry for getting too technical, but we're talking about how the information reaches the citizen. And in addition to that, well, I want to receive alerts about the processing. And for you can enable an alert and they can get notifications. So with this, we are inverting the logic. We are inverting the logic, which would be the logic of the citizens seeking out the information, but now the information is reaching the citizen. And this has always been the idea. Initially, we created APIs that were very much used. Currently, they're not as popular anymore because it's too bureaucratic. We need to update and people install them and stop using them. So the communication channels in Brazil, for example, WhatsApp, is the easiest way to access information currently. So we currently focus in moving away from the app and using WhatsApp. And we recommend that the parliaments have approaches considering the characteristics of their country. Like we were talking to people from Essential, there is more text messages or iMessage. So trying to connect to instant messaging and not reinvent the wheel and create new communication channels. That would be one point. And I think we need to offer paths for people to find the information and understand if we won't only want to be consulted or if we want to be understood. Because if we're just being consulted, we have information traffic, but being understood creates democracy, which is what we believe in. So generative AI can give scale to that understanding, but only if the parliament accepts the challenge of being clear, traceable, and governed.
Excellent consideration, Bruno. It's good that you bring these technical elements so that we can understand a little bit about the depth of this subject. Now I'd like to hand over to Ludovic.
Yeah. So on this topic, of Generative has the potential either or to deepen democracy or to quietly erode democracy. So the difference lies not in the model, but how parliaments frame its role. To genuinely enhance understanding, these tools will be designed as companions to civic reasoning to support critical thinking. And that's one maybe of the major points that we have to ensure with AI. That was the topic of a conference I made with a high school in Luxembourg 1 year ago about how can we maintain critical thinking in the society and not delegating the reasoning and the interpretation to another AI or agentic option that would prepare it for you and that you will just consume instead of suggesting this critical thinking. So this is not a shortcut to conclusion. AI has not to be a shortcut. We have to maintain this critical thinking. This is really the foundation of a society. If we remove critical thinking, then we are not in a democratic society anymore. And legislative processes are complex by nature. They involve trade-off, compromises, and procedural constraints by nature. And AI only produces clean summaries, risks flattening this reality. An AI that explains why complexity exists builds democratic legitimacy. Trust emerges when citizens can trace answers back to source and logic. This means every response should be anchored in authoritative parliamentary material and make that anchoring visible. Situation, links, procedural references, and clear distinctions between fact, interpretation, and context are essential. Transparency must be experienced and not declared. And just to come back on the point that you were mentioning before on ChatGPT, if you remember when we released our first generative AI agent in the parliament that was called Archibot documented a couple of years ago, this was really the essence of the agent. The essence was that each sentences that were provided to the citizen could be related to an authoritative source. We were giving the official document from the Parliament, the available languages, metadata, and moreover, we added one dimension that was the token that was used in the indexation process to generate the sentence, so that each of the sentences could be related to an authoritative source. At this time being, even ChatGPT was not performing this function. It was only delivering a text, and under requests of the citizen or the end user was providing sources that were used, even sometimes acknowledging that some information was created from scratch just for the narrative of the answer, and something that you could not find by yourself, even just sometimes asking for this question. So on this point, I will not claim that the tool we prepared and we released for the citizen was perfect, far from that. But this question of critical thinking was at the essence of the creation of the chatbot. You could relate any sentence we did to the authoritative tools from the Parliament, and that's fundamental. That's really fundamental. So another key element is, as you mentioned, also the institutional voice. A conversational system should not mimic personal opinions or adopt persuasive tone. Its role is not to convince, but to clarify. When the system explains divergent positions, it should do so symmetrically. When it explains outcomes, it should show process, not intent. Participation is strengthened when citizens feel that understanding enables agency. Conversational tools can help citizens identify where decisions are made, which actors are involved, and how engagement is possible, not by encouraging reaction, but by illuminating pathways. Understanding precedes participation. Equally important is avoiding institutional disconnection. If a conventional system presents answers that contradict live parliamentary practice or oversimplify institutional constraints, it will undermine trust. This requires close alignment between the system's behavior and the institution's real processes. Finally, parliaments must recognize that trust is a cumulative and fragile component. These tools should be introduced gradually, clearly framed, and continuously evaluated. Citizens should know what the system is, what it is not, and how it is governed. Trust grows when institutions remain visible behind the interface. And I would just re-insist on the notion of critical thinking. It's fundamental that any agents provided to citizens enable them to build their own knowledge and to think by themselves. And according to the participation, I would be extremely careful on this topic. We are in elective systems by which the citizen delegates their representativity to people elected that are senators or members. In this process, everybody has to keep its role and responsibility. You cannot necessarily ask for a citizen to engage in political discussions or in legislative text with the institution. And I think we had long exchanges on this topic many years ago, but we clearly need to ensure that everybody remains in the scope of responsibility. You cannot transfer the responsibility to exchange on legislative text with the citizen. We have members, we have senators, this is their role, this is their function, and this is their duty. Of course, we can explain, we can highlight, we can provide information, but always having in mind that we have to build the critical thinking of the citizen, that if they would have deeper questions, can always relate not necessarily to the institution, but to the members or the senators who represent them inside this legislative process so that they could be considered.
Muito obrigado, Ludovic. Antes de passar a palavra
Thank you,
ao
Ludovic.
João,
Before I hand over to João,
o projeto do
Ludovic
Artbot.
mentioned the Artbot
Depois acho que
project,
tem
and
como
I
seu
think
filho o Artilibot também, né,
and
do
the
Chile.
Chilibot from Chile.
É projeto que
It's a
até
project
aqui
that
com o apoio do IDEA
here with
Internacional,
the support of
outras organizações
IDEA
tem sido
and
feito
other
benchmark
organization, they've
da
done a
América Latina.
benchmarking within Latin America. I think they demonstrate something that is fundamental. Ludovic was the responsible for the archives. You have Daniel. This is one very enthusiastic about the American Congress archives. They have the IRS. Danilo was the general consultant here in our house, the legislative consultant in Brazil. Not only but also it creates the reports. It gives munition to parliamentarians about that knowledge. What do I want to say with that? That the parliament is sitting on a database of human knowledge of high quality, of people who could be writing this for a doctorate, but they're providing this to Parliament, and this knowledge is used once or twice by the parliamentary and is not used. So just to say that the project, the Ludovic, about the Artbot, and then our friends Miguel Landeiros in Chile with the Chile bot, I think Uruguay as well will create a version of the Artbot. So I think it's fundamental, it's important, the work that is being done for legislative work. And João, sorry for the small comments, and I'll hand the floor to you. So the trust of the citizens on the information that Parliament offers, something we cannot risk. And the paradox of generative AI, that it can seem very helpful while inducing citizens to mistakes. So the Air Canada example illustrates this. The chatbot wasn't hostile or confusing. Quite the opposite. It was very helpful, gave clear answers, plausible, and even connected it to the links of the page. Of course, the user didn't research. He was satisfied with the chatbot, but the answer was wrong, and Jake Moffat trusted. So in the legislative context, this risk is even worse. Imagine a citizen asking chatbot, when can I retire? And then he seeks the general rules and says, you can retire at 65 with 15 years of contribution. Seems useful, but it's a trap. This answer disregards rules, categories, professional categories, acquired rights, and other issues. So the citizen thinks they have reliable information, but when they just have a dangerous simplification. In a regulative state, it's never in one article. So it demands to cross different sources, analysis of the individual situation, and even predominant jurisprudence. To do that safely with AI is a risk that Air Canada took and was condemned for. So the model we defend is not the AI that applies norms and interprets, but the responsive AI that prioritizes the correct treatment of the demand and not the quickness in response. The chatbot was responsive, but was not responsible. They didn't verify if the answer was correct, didn't direct the client to the adequate source. Our model inverts this. The AI can take a little longer instead of answering directly, but the citizen will have the correct guidance. In Act 45 that regulates AI for administrative procedures, it puts the explicability as central fundamental. The third article defines as the possible of the logic used by the system. So explicability is essential, not a functionality, but how to do it technically. This is where the orchestrator is essential. When the citizen asks, he first classifies, is an individual demand that regarding the application of norm, is it a general on legislative themes? If it's individual, of when I can retire, the system shouldn't answer. For information for your specific, the competent is the INSS. Can I give you the contact and the channels? If it's of general character, I find it unfair that teachers don't have a different role. They can suggest another path. You can register and send to senators, and I found 3 law bills that are ongoing on teachers' retirement. Do you want to see them? If there is no project that deals with your demand, you can register a legislative suggestion. So in this example, the AI did not solve directly the issue for the citizen. It connects it in each case to the correct institutional path. That's a responsible AI without having to have all answers. Trust will not come from AI that pretends to know all. It will come from AI that knows its role to be a bridge between citizens and the services and competent institutions.
Muito obrigado, João.
Thank you, João. Now I'd like to hand over to Daniel, if you'd like to comment.
Thank you very much. I think I've really enjoyed the conversation. I think I'd like to start with 2 very, very fast stories. So my job 20 years ago was to provide legal advice to Congress. I worked for the Congressional Research Service, and I provide advice to all 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate and all of their staff on 3 different issue areas: matters of church and state, national security, and telecommunications. And so I wrote reports and I answered questions. I was human Gen AI, right? That's what I was doing. That's what we all did. There were several hundred of us, and our responsibility was to answer the questions. And we would write our answers, and then it would go through 3 levels of review. And with each level of review, the answer became less and less useful for the person asking for it. It would become less timely. It would have less context, right? Because we were trying to avoid an institutional risk. The institutional risk is answering a question in a way that would be politically controversial. So the way I would, if you asked me, what is the shape of the Earth? I would say, well, on one hand, some people say it's round, and on the other hand, I would say some people say it's flat. And that would be my answer, right? And that is a terrible answer. Nobody should use, right? I mean, unless you're in the 15th century, like this is probably not the answer that you would find to be particularly useful. So that's one story. Second story, we have a website called congress.gov. Congress.gov is where you can look up all legislation that is recent. And citizens were very interested in learning about a healthcare bill that was being debated. And so they would go and they would search for it on Congress.gov and they'd bring up the bill. And you could see they had a list of the top 10 most looked at bills, and this was number 1. And they were all looking at the wrong bill. Because no one said, by the way, you're looking at this, but it's like when if I send an email to Luís and it goes to a different Luís, like, did you really mean to email him this thing? Like, no, you actually meant to send it to someone else with the same name, right? This is not an AI problem, right? This is a context problem. There is a saying in American politics and probably elsewhere as well, like everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own facts. But facts are also contingent, right? Facts are useful. They can be marshaled to make different assessments. And when we're talking about Gen AI, we're talking about all the use cases lumped together. And I think that we need to make a distinction, right? If the question is the House of Representatives in session today? That is a pretty straightforward question that has a deterministic answer. There's a hearing that's happening this week. What are the relevant Congressional Research Service reports? Well, that's not as deterministic, but we can do things. We can say, well, I think that these prior reports are likely to be relevant, and I can give you a how likely am I right score. My organization, we built a tool that compares legislative ideas. We're trying to track legislative ideas as they move through the parliamentary process. And we gave people confidence scores. We're like, we think that this provision was actually came from this other provision 2 years ago, which someone came up with 6 years ago, and like we tried to put it together for them. And we didn't say that it was because we didn't know, and we certainly couldn't do it. There's 15,000 bills introduced each Congress. You would have to be crazy to try to do that analysis yourself. You need tools to deal with that. But at the same time, it's necessary. The US Congress right now does not make available real-time transcripts of its House and Senate proceedings. If you want the transcript, you have to wait months or years. And the reason you wait months or years is because the members of Congress want to go through the transcript, and if they said something that makes them look kind of silly, they'll just go and erase it, and they'll take it out. So they're making the transcripts less accurate and less timely. So if you're a person with disabilities, or if you want to run it through a data model, you can't do that through the official sources because the concern is about power, right? Because information is power. That was Lord Acton. And when we talk about information, what we're really talking about is power. And one of the contexts that we're talking about this here is in the legislative context. And there was, gosh, I forget who said it, was the WhatsApp point, right? Like engaging with the information where people are. Well, one of the challenges that we're having in the US context is, okay, so Congress is debating these issues, but it's also in a fight with the executive branch. And if it takes days or weeks or months for information that you need that is relevant to the public debate to be made available through legislative channels, when you have other folks who can use social media, we were having this conversation earlier, other mechanisms to share information at, AI generated real, well, here's actually what things look like that just happened, or here's actually what this report says. You're in a battle between speed and relevance and accuracy. And that is another thing that we're balancing. I don't think about, is this analysis from Gen AI, is it right or wrong? Is it more accurate than what you can get through other channels? Like, what is our benchmark? And when I think about designing systems, the first thing I think is, well, let's not use what can we do through non-Gen AI, right? What can we do through natural language processing? What can we use through all these other, what is the cheapest, fastest, right? Other systems that we know are more reliable. And then is there a human layer? So when I'm looking for this healthcare bill, I want to find the actual bill. I don't want to find the wrong bill that everybody else has found because that doesn't do anybody any good. So as we're having this conversation, how do we validate, right? Okay, I've got this Gen AI tool. Do I have another Gen AI tool checking it? Do I have a human layer that checks it? Is there a feedback loop? Like, what does this look like? And is it the British have an expression, fit for purpose? Is the use case that we're trying to use this technology, is it fit for the purpose that we're trying to use it for? And is there something else that would be better or worse than what we're using at that particular moment? So I hope that's, see, I'm trying. Was I good? Time? Yes. I'm trying this.
Don't look at the clock. My recommendation is don't look at the clock.
So in the US Congress, they have a clock with like a 5-minute thing that goes green, yellow, red. So like my training is always just like, I'm waiting for it to count down, like, all right, you're cut off. So sorry.
Mas acho que só comentário do que o Daniel falou. I think
Just a comment.
I'm doing this one in English so you can hear me directly. There is a particular case in the US House that I absolutely love it from our dear friend Steve Dwyer, which is the Dome Watch.
Yeah.
And for those colleagues that are not familiar, I highly recommend you go to your app store and download it. It's an app developed by a common friend from the US House of Representatives to follow basic legislative procedures, what is in the vote, what is being discussed on the floor, etc. And I remember when he told me that the live vote was being broadcast in the TV, in the analog signal from the TV, but they could not get that information to be uploaded directly into the app. And they got denied by the administration at the time in the House.
Yes.
Certainly, Daniel can explain the history better. And what they did is they didn't use Gen AI. Well, some people are going to be mad at me because some people say OCR is not AI, but they use OCR to scrap the information from the TV channel and feed it into the app. So if you want to comment that, Daniel.
Yeah, the level of ridiculous workarounds. So the story is even better than what you describe. So Steve was in the Democratic leader's office. So this is a very powerful office inside the House, but they could not get the feed from the House clerks for the votes. But not just that, if you've ever been to the US Congress, there are all of these clocks around and they have little lights on them and they buzz. And if you know what it means, and nobody knows what it means because no one is like it says there's a vote happening now or there will be a vote. I mean, if you're a visitor, you think that like the building is burning down, but it's just and the way that the clocks buzz is because they receive a radio signal. There's a radio signal that's generated on the Hart Senate office building that travels about 1.5 miles, and they have $1,000 clocks that pull down this analog signal that causes the buzz. But there's no data feed for that, or at least there wasn't. They're actually building it now. So Steve had a friend who lived within 2 miles of the Capitol. So he built a radio receiver to receive the signal to transmit it into something that was the predecessor for Dome Watch. And this is absolutely stupid, right? Like you should not have to do this type of thing, but it is very common to hack around the system to try to solve these types of technology problems, and we do it routinely. There is this great and overwhelming fear that someone is going to get information from an official channel somehow, and you're going to get blamed for it. That somehow that like this vote is happening now, and maybe you misunderstand what the vote is, or maybe so, like that somehow that will create political blowback, and thus the institutional channels are reluctant to do this. One of the things that I do, so I along with a colleague, I write the world's most boring newsletter. Right? It's difficult, like on the level, like it's called the First Branch Forecast. And what we do is we write about legislative procedure and the history of Congress. Because at least in our circumstance, the average congressional staffer is there 18 months. They turn over very quickly, 3 years for their career. Members of Congress aren't there for very long either. And nobody remembers what happened before. There is no sense of context. And the consequence is that every time you're solving a problem, you have a bunch of really bright people who are taking it on de novo for the first time because they don't know what came before. And the people that had my job at the Congressional Research Service, right, who are supposed to provide the context, I'm providing legal advice on matters of church and state, and I was 1 year out of law school, right? That's not great. That is not what you want either. So when I think about like Gen AI or tools like this, I think about there is this entire corpus of information that we can use to provide context to people when they're trying to decide stuff, but it's limited by questions around power, and that those themselves are the people who have it don't want others to understand the way the process can work in different types of ways, and that creates barriers to access to the information. So sorry, that was my second answer was even longer than my first, but yes, I hope that was useful.
Muito obrigado, Daniel. Foi perfeita, porque eu acho que você toca
Thank you
num
very
ponto
much,
que é o
Daniel.
contexto,
Perfect. I
contexto
think you
temporal,
mentioned something very
da
important, which is
informação.
context
E eu gosto muito de
and
uma
the
expressão
temporality of the
de um grande
information.
amigo
And I
meu de
really
Portugal,
like an
inclusive,
expression of a
que
great
ele
friend
fala
that I
que
have from Portugal.
a
And he
verdade está
says
colocando as
that
calças, a mentira já
while
correu a volta
the
do mundo
truth is
inteiro.
putting on its pants,
Então,
the lie has
queria passar a
already
palavra
gone
à
all
Sara
over the
Fernandes.
world.
Sara, você gostaria
And
de
I'd
ter a
like
última
to
palavra
pass it over
nesse
to
mesmo
Sara.
tópico?
Eu gostaria.
Well,
Primeiro, eu estou a gostar muito
first,
do painel.
I'm really enjoying this panel, and thank you for inviting me. And I really like the part where Ludovic talked about critical thinking. And we are in a very momentous time, and I'm a professor. I have taught for 23 years, and I have felt that critical thinking is disappearing. And what we feel in society is that critical thinking will also disappear when we use, be it AI or any type of recommendation system. Critical thinking tends to disappear. And we are in a very unique moment in history in 1914, 1918, 1939, 45, we had historic periods in time, especially in Europe, that have changed the world. And we also had something called the Industrial Revolution in the beginning of the 19th century, which is the basis of our current universities. What we have in the universities was designed during the Industrial Revolution. The industry needed specific things, and the universities were seeking out professionals to meet the market's expectations. Currently, we are in a very different scenario. We are in a scenario where technology is more and more prevalent, and there is a rush for answers. And that's why we are losing this critical thinking, and we're giving space to fake news, to misinterpretation, and having the facts but not having the context. And if we don't start demanding critical thinking, and the parliaments have a added responsibility in this, we will reach a point where it won't be enough to have the chatbots where we have facts, and the chatbot will have to start learning to say, I don't know the answer, because this currently doesn't happen. We need to start looking effectively at how we are building our society, how we are seeking out tools and implementing this critical thinking. And that's why, because it's a topic that directly concerns me. When Ludovic talked about critical thinking, we are here in a moment where we can talk about the whole of society and where we need to think and to transform our society. And I won't mention how in Portugal, every new administration, and we have many, we have yearly elections. We talked a lot about reforms, and there's a problem with reforms because the reforms maintain their core. The government is the same. We changed the surroundings of the basis, but the reform keeps the same logic. We need to talk about transformation and to change everything that currently exists. And when we talk about generative AI, critical thinking, context, all of these topics need to be discussed. And my time is almost up. I would like to leave you with a proposal, because I have heard everything you're proposing, and I really believe the whole of society context. We need to bring the academia, the businesses, the government, public administration, and citizens, everybody. And I leave you with the challenge of creating a platform where we can share good practices, challenges, and all of the mistakes that we make, because we make mistakes. On our part, me and João from the Portuguese Parliament, we make mistakes, and that's not a problem for me. I am prepared to be wrong and also to learn from that mistake. And I propose that we create this platform to share these experiences. We were talking about writing something, but we should perhaps take the next step and create a platform to gather all of these actors that have wonderful experiences to share. And we can do what the Americans like to do, which is the leapfrog, and advance with the use of AI and other technologies in improving our parliaments and the service provided to the citizens. Thank you very much for your considerations. And I'll make a comment. Our friend Neemias from Angola will remember a seminar we were at in December. And at the end of the discussion, we asked the colleagues to share not only successful cases, because it's nice to talk about what works. We're proud. We like to be part of a panel talking about a beautiful project, a new toy we came up with. but we need to talk about what went wrong. We need to talk about the fact that we tried to do something and it didn't work because of this, and that. And even though we have parliamentary systems that are significantly different, the principle of the Parliament's work is extremely similar. Even in the Commonwealth model, if compared to the Brazilian model, we have differences, but the work is still very similar. So we have this possibility of sharing experiences and common experiences. And part of that is the reason why we created Bússola Tech, this research center building this repository of information. A couple of years ago, I thought about my thesis, which was that it would be very interesting for the public power to have not manuals, not guidelines, but experiences. These experiences worked, these didn't, and you're not going to copy and paste. You can think perhaps this experience works partially for what I need. It's about doing a brainstorming of ideas. And even more than the executive branch, the parliament is a very interesting place to do that. So thank you for your comment, and this allows us to reflect on why we're here discussing this. And I will move on to my last question because I see we're short on time. Don't worry, because it's not that time on the watch. We have a bit more time. And my last question will start with Ludovic. Ludovic, even when we're talking about the generation augmented by recovery, which is HAG, to anchor the generative AI system in official legislative sources, they reduce, but they will not eliminate the risk of hallucinations. So my question to you is how parliaments should manage in a responsible way these remaining risks when dealing with a public that does not necessarily know a lot about parliamentary activity. And here I give an interesting example from my friends from Chile. They did an embedding within the Caminar design. The person cannot make a new consultation or send a new message if they don't give the feedback that if that information that was generated is correct or not, and if not, they need to say why. So this makes sense for us to demand from a parliamentary professional that works with that on their daily lives. This doesn't make sense for us to demand from the common citizen that does not have a specific knowledge about the legislative process. So that's my question. How can we manage and responsibly manage these risks when dealing with the broader public, especially when we're talking about information that's not confidential? Most of the information from the parliament is open, but which is politically sensitive, right? So I'd like you to make considerations about that.
Thank you very much for the question. I would just make a very slight difference between the answer to political sensitivity rather than legislative sensitivity. In the administration within the parliaments, we are very often answering to legislative sensitivity. Political sensitivity goes more for political groups, members, or in this case, senators. So I would just add just slightly on this point. But as you clearly stated, even with retrieval augmented generation, which is one of the basic architecture used to produce AI agents, risk remains. So hallucinations may be reduced, but ambiguity, misinterpretation, or contextual errors cannot be eliminated. So when engaging a broad non-technical public on legislative sensitive matters, responsible management of these risks becomes central. So the first principle is humility. A parliamentary AI system must acknowledge the limits of automated interpretation. It should be designed to surface uncertainty explicitly. Phrases such as according to available records. This provision is interpreted differently depending on context, or this matter is subject to a legislative or political debate are not weaknesses. They are safeguards. Second, risk management must be differentiated. Not all the legislative information carries the same sensitivity. Procedural explanations, historical facts, and public documents pose lower risks. Ongoing negotiations, politically charged reforms, or legal interpretation affecting rights require stricter control. In some cases, a correct response may be to redirect to official documents or human contact points with a sustainable design rather than generate an answer. And some cases that were previously mentioned that if you design your solution by only providing an automatic answer, you may have to face rapid limitations, such as individual cases, such as João mentioned. You have to have the opportunity within these AI solutions to point out to human beings, to redirect to human beings by identifying that the sensitivity of the question will not be addressed by an AI agent, but that would correspond more to a human one. Third, parliaments must take responsibility for escalation path. When a system detects ambiguity, contradiction, or high sensitivity, it should slow down rather than improvise. This may mean offering multiple perspectives or explicitly stating that no single authoritative answer exists. Oversight is essential. Continuous monitoring of system outputs, feedback, loops with users. I just take a 30 seconds to find it.
You can go.
Yeah. This is a wake-up call. So they are part of the institutional accountability, and errors should be treated as learning opportunities, not as anomalies to be hidden. And finally, parliaments must resist the temptation to treat these systems as neutral. They are interpretative instruments operating in a political and legislative space. Responsibility cannot be delegated to algorithm. It remains institutional, collective, and ethical. Used wisely, generative AI can help parliaments speak more clearly, listen more attentively, and explain themselves more honestly. Used carelessly, it risks replacing institutional silence with artificial certainty. The difference lies in governance, design, and deep respect for democratic complexity. And in this case, I provided to Luís, and it can be shared with you, 5 books that I have written since last October. And each of these books address one of the dimensions of artificial intelligence related to a domain. The first one is about artificial intelligence and continuity, because what we are doing in parliaments is mainly maintaining business continuity. And all these books have been written in terms that are non-technical. These are for non-technical people to understand the relationships of AI between a specific domain. And this is books written with narratives. There are characters. It's a little bit philosophical. It's a little bit poetic. So it's absolutely not an administrative production. It's a work fiction, if you prefer. The second one is about AI and ethics. And all these different books are using real cases behind. The one about ethics is a request that was made by a member to benefit from an AI assistant to better understand and analyze amendments within the budgetary procedure. So what would be the impact of an amendment in the budgetary procedure of establishing the budget from the European Union? And this was the use case that I used in order to produce this book about AI and ethics, how to fix the boundaries of ethics. The second one is about AI and sustainability. And this is not because you have a solution that respects ethics that it will be sustainable. And we were mentioning before the question of the design of the solution and the architecture of the solution. It's part of the answer, not the only one, but it's part of the answer on sustainability. And in this case, the use case I use is a multilingual chatbot to answer to citizens. That is at the heart of the European Parliament, by which we have 24 official languages in which we answer. So it highlights how a sustainable system could be designed. The fourth one is about AI and cybersecurity. This is one of the topics that we are addressing on every day. So identifying several threats and how an AI, which is in this case an AI legislative companion, analyzing all the legislative documents which are produced by the House and exchanged within the House, and how this one can be hacked and what would be potential consequences of this threat. And the last one is about AI and autonomy. What would happen is one day you have the feeling that the AI solution that you provide to the members or to the senators becomes suddenly autonomous. And you lose control on this one. And they have all the knowledge, all the archives, all the legislative trends, all the political explanations behind them, and they try to act autonomously. So this is the fifth book that has been written. So all of them are available. You can ask them to Luís. You can read them. It's 40 minutes time to read each of the books. They are unfortunately available only in English. I apologize for the other languages, but I think that this will complement this conclusion on residual risks.
Muito obrigado, Ludovic. A gente vai enviar
Thank you, Ludovic.
todos no
We will send
grupo que nós
these
temos ali em
to
conjunto
the group
também.
we have jointly,
Obviamente a todos os
and
colegas
obviously
que
to
depois estejam
all
assistindo
colleagues
essa gravação,
that are seeing this recording.
isso também estará disponível.
This will be made
A todos
available
os demais. Eu
to
vou passar
the.
a palavra a Sara Fernandes. Sara, você gostaria de fazer?
I'll hand over to Sara.
palavras?
Sara, do you want to speak?
Há uns anos atrás eu ouvi
So a few years ago, I was in a conference
admirava imenso,
with someone, Mr. Ken Robson, Sir Ken Robson, which I admire very much. They were in a panel,
tinha que apresentar era o Dalai Lama.
and one of those who would present would be the Dalai Lama.
Dalai Lama, não há muita apresentação
When it was
que
the
possa fazer, não é?
Dalai Lama, there isn't much you can present. I think you've reached everything. And someone asked the Dalai Lama
da audiência,
from the audience. Someone asked a question,
a resposta. Uma pessoa pensa sempre que o Dalai Lama tem a resposta para
and
tudo.
you think he would have an answer for
A
everything.
resposta que ele deu
And the answer he gave
"Eu não
was,
sei,
I do
nunca
not
pensei
know.
nisso."
Never thought about that.
E portanto, vão-me perdoar,
So you will
mas eu nunca pensei
pardon me,
neste tema para poder
but I
dar
never
uma
thought about
importância,
this theme
para poder dar uma resposta
to give an answer
estudada
that
e
is
séria.
studied and serious.
Portanto, eu senti-me agora num momento Dalai Lama.
So I felt myself in a Dalai Lama situation or moment.
Obrigado, Sara.
Thank you,
Essa
Sara.
palavra
I will hand over to Daniel.
Thank you. I too have been in the presence of the Dalai Lama. But he was giving a commencement speech, so we didn't get to ask any questions, which is too bad. So just in hearing the conversation up to this point, I will learn at some point. I think one thing that is useful context or something to think about is both scale and money. If we had infinite money, which of course is not the case in parliaments, a lot of this work could be done by people and would be done by expert people. Some of it we couldn't scale up to be fast enough, but a lot of it we could, right? We're trying to solve a money problem and a power problem and a scale problem with a new tool. And that tool can help address some of them. So like one scenario I think about is, so the US Congress receives millions of communications from constituents every year and millions of phone calls. What happens when somebody decides to spin up a bunch of voices and jam the phone lines? We do that now, right? This is a DDoS attack. We do it through people now, right? If you have a mass organization, you can close down the phones by having hundreds of thousands of people call in. So if you have, technology as a way of doing this, how does the Congress respond, right? Do they does everyone just pick up the phone, which is what happens now, which means that all work basically stops? Do you send them to voicemail, which is not a politically appropriate answer because members of Congress want to give you the sense that they're always going to pick up the phone? Do you turn on an answering personas that thank you for calling? Your views are important to us. Like we would, and have an AI to AI conversation, right? Which is not unreasonable. Like the average member of the House of Representatives has up to 18 staff to do all the work that they do. And that number has been constant since 1978. And even as their constituencies have grown by 50%. So the amount of work that they have to do has increased significantly, but the popular support for paying them, giving them sufficient funds to do the work has not. So you see a decrease in the funding that is available for this work. So we can't throw people at the problem. If we throw AI at the problem, we're creating other incentives, right? Some good, some not good. We had talked earlier about having you need to have a human in the loop to vet things. You need to have an iterative process. You need to be able to audit the responses. Well, this is all out of work, right? That we're describing. Some things you can automate, like how reliable was this? Maybe you can answer some of those questions. Maybe you can't. And then underneath, is there a true neutrality? Is there true objectivity that exists? Or are we just trading off one set of biases for another set of biases? So I took your role and I just asked questions instead of answering them, but that's
You have your Dalai Lama moment as well.
yes. I don't know the answer, but I know that the answer does not reside within me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Daniel. João, você gostaria de trazer alguma reflexão nesse tema também?
Thank you, Daniel. João, would you want to reflect
Ontem eu
upon
liguei
this?
para o Dalai Lama.
Yesterday I called Dalai Lama.
Essa é a pergunta mais
That
difícil,
is the hardest question
exige a resposta
because it
mais
demands
honesta.
the most honest response.
Muita gente acredita que o
Many
método
people think
Retrieval Augmented Generation,
the-
RAG, a
The
técnica
RAG
de
retrieval
forçar a IA
of
a buscar
forcing
trechos de
AI
textos
to seek
oficiais para compor o
official
contexto,
text to make up their
resolve
text
o problema
would
da
solve the
alucinação.
problem of
Se a
hallucinations.
IA só lê fontes autorizadas,
If they only
erra
read
texto.
authorized sources, they won't make things
No
up.
caso da
That's
Air
what they think.
Canada,
But the
prova que
case of
isso
Air
é
Canada
verdade.
proves that is
O
not
chatbot tinha
true.
acesso à política
The
oficial,
chatbot
inclusive
had
em boa
access
fase
to
de
the
correção
official
diagnóstica.
documents and they
Mas
linked correctly to
interpretou
that,
errado.
but they
Disse ao
interpreted
passageiro que ele
wrongly.
poderia
And he
pedir
told the
reembolso
passenger
depois da
they
viagem, quando a
could
política
ask for reimbursement
dizia
after,
antes.
when the policy
O
said
método
before.
resolve o problema
So the
da
method solves the
fonte, mas não
problems
resolve
of
o
the
problema da
source, but
interpretação.
not of the
No Estado
interpretation.
regulador moderno,
In a
onde
modern
normas se
regulatory state
sobrepõem
where
às
norms
exceções e
and
exceções são a regra,
exceptions to the rules
a
are
interpretação é tudo.
the interpretation is
Deixa eu dar
everything.
exemplo
Let me
na
give you an
legislação
example
brasileira.
in the
O
legislative
direito à
example of
moradia
Brazil. The right to
precisa fazer, o
habitation
artigo 6º,
in
claro,
Article
a
6 says
moradia é
that clearly
direito social.
that having
A IA
housing
pode
is
ler
a social
esse
right.
artigo perfeitamente.
The
E se
AI
um
can read this
cidadão,
article
por exemplo, em situação
perfectly.
de rua,
And so
perguntar
if a citizen
se
who's
tem
living in
direito
the
a uma
street
casa,
said, do I
e a
have
IA
the right to a
responder
house?
sim, a
And
Constituição
AI
garante
answered,
isso no
yes,
artigo 6º,
Constitution guarantees that
ele
on
estará
Article
citando
6.
a fonte
It will be
correta
having the
e
correct
não a
source
interpretação
with a
desastrosa.
disastrous
A
interpretation.
moradia é direito social
Housing
fundamental que
is a
orienta
fundamental
as políticas
social
do
right
Estado.
that
Não
orients
significa
state
que qualquer pessoa
policies.
pode exigir uma
Doesn't
casa
mean
amanhã
that
com base
anyone
nesse
can
artigo.
demand a house
Para
tomorrow
isso,
based on
são
that article.
necessárias
For
políticas
that, you
públicas
need
que criem
public
programas,
policies that create
definam
programs,
critérios,
define
aloquem
criteria,
recursos
allocate
e realizem a
resources,
política.
and carry out
A
that
IA
policy.
confundiu um valor
AI
orientador com a regra de
confused
aplicação
orienting
imediata que
value
existe em
with
qualquer
the rule of
lei.
immediate
Aliás,
application.
no
In
direito
fact,
existe uma
in
discussão aí
in
há
law,
décadas
there are decades of
sobre a diferença
discussion
em princípio e regra.
between principle and
Já
rule.
se gastaram rios de tintas
We've
nessa
spent
discussão
rivers of ink in that
e até
discussion,
hoje não
and
temos
until
solução
today,
para
we
isso.
don't have a solution.
Uma coisa interessante, em
So an interesting
68,
thing, in
67,
1968,
antes de eu nascer,
67, sorry, before I
o
was
juiz
born,
York falou, olha, essa
they
diferença de
said
regra e
this
princípio é de
difference between rule and principle
lógica,
is of a
isto é,
logical
não depende
nature.
do conteúdo,
It doesn't depend on the
depende da
content,
forma.
depends on the form.
Sendo que em 2009
Being
Dwork
that in
morreu,
2009,
não
Dwork
mostrou essa
died
diferença lógica.
and didn't
Outros
show this
autores
logical
lamentam que ele não
difference,
fez isso.
so other authors
Luís,
lament that he
estou
didn't do
trabalhando há
that.
5 anos no
So,
artigo
Luis, I've been working
em que eu
5 years in
explico
this
essa
article
forma lógica
where I
de
break up
regras,
this logical form
princípios
of rules
e
and
policies.
principles
Policies
and
entendidas
policies.
como diretrizes normativas
Policies
para o
understood
caso
as
do direito à
norms
moradia.
like this
Esse ano foi
for
ser
the
publicado o
right to
artigo,
housing.
será
So
assunto
there'll
em
be an
outro
article being
participação
published
em
next
outro
year,
painel, mas voltando
and we
aqui
might be in another panel
à nossa
participating.
linha de
But
raciocínio.
going back to our
Como
line of
pretendemos
thinking,
então
how do we
enfrentar
intend
isso no
to
Senado?
face this in the
São
Senate
3 camadas de proteção.
with 3 levels of
Primeiro,
protection? Firstly, architecture. Before any response, it is necessary that the system categorize the question to know if an individual demand or of general character of the citizens question. So we need that to have the adequate flow. If it's an individual demand, like the retirement example, AI is not going to calculate because it's a concrete case and orient that he seek out an executive power institution that deals with that. If it's a general question, you will send it to the Senate. Senator will research law bills and also about the legislative idea. Air Canada wanted a responsive, quick responses. So they had an irresponsible AI and generated judicial proceedings. We want the opposite, AI that doesn't know with security, like the Dalai Lama will say, I do not know, or will send you to whoever knows. And that's institutional responsibility. The normative base of governance Act from the Director General says that automatized decisions have to be reviewed and validated by human operators. And the third and decisive, human mediation. A position I defend with conviction is, in the current stage of technology, interaction systems on legislative content with generative AI must be developed and tested, but for internal use by trained civil servants. The direct opening and not mediated to citizens is premature at this moment. In the future, maybe for legal and legislative issues. And in 2025, the Ombudsman of Senate dealt with 30,000 calls, and we got 95% of satisfaction. This result doesn't come from automatized responses. It comes from humans dealing who know how to distinguish between an individual question to those of a more general character that must be registered and directed to parliamentarians. This process is being optimized with generative AI. It has to be the support tool to these teams, and the program in Senate is called apoiar, support in Portuguese. It's a support tool. A trained civil servant can detect when the AI's response is too simple or when the individual is in a situation of vulnerability, and this sensitivity is not possible to the machine. The Canadian court says that Air Canada didn't take reasonable care to guarantee precision of information. Reasonable care in Parliament is to keep a human civil servant as a final validator. So my conclusion is direct. Artificial intelligence in the Parliament is inevitable and welcome. We have to develop, test, and train teams. But the direct opening and autonomous actions to the citizens for interactions is still not safe. We defend the responsive AI model with human mediation. The machine makes categories, orients, and sends. The civil servant can validate and deliver so that the citizen receives what he needs, not an instantaneous response that could be wrong, but the correct guidance to the service or to the adequate institution. Thank you, João. Bruno, since you talked to the Dalai Lama recently, would you like? I'm going to do some philosophy as well, but I'll talk about the technical part and some personal opinions. To start, Enemias in that panel, he talked about the wrong cases, and I will talk about a case. We were setting a system that created automatic podcasts based on the propositions. So we sent some of the podcasts in the municipal chamber of Gramado, which is a touristic city. It was a cool result, but in one of the cases, which was an administrative reform, we asked to generate a script. It was a chit-chat between two people, questions and answers, and we asked for informal language, because that would be the public that would be hearing. We validated the project, but we did that in a little bit more complex, and these changed the functions and the roles. And so one of the roles was for the deputy mayor, and they did informal jokes, because we had asked it to be informal, and the script, of course, wasn't used because there was a human evaluation. It wasn't automatically published. But imagine if it had been put into a official channel. It wasn't a mistake in context or information. It was correct, but the prompt, and that's where we see in the negative review, a badly written prompt can create a problematic answer, but that's sometimes not enough. We can't teach all users to have better prompts. That's impossible. So there will always be an inequality of the answer due to the written question. That will always happen. About politically sensitive issues, and implementing our AI that gives reports from our commissions, a parliamentarian in Paraná asked during the training, what is the ideology of the AI? A very good question, and I had to answer. I can't say it doesn't have an ideology or a bias. That's impossible, because even the person who is apolitical, that's a choice, an ideology. They can be a technicist. That's how the AI works. It tries to be as technical as possible without giving opinions that might go to one side or the other. Or you can give what are the two sides. Not only just eliminate the two opinions, but to say what are the two sides' opinions. So we always ask the AI not to give it opinions, and in the chat bots, it's more like a search engine to show the path, so reducing opinative or incorrect answers. So for example, if I ask for information on a project, they can extract basic information, but it's not going to discuss the real impact of that project to citizens. So one technical part, we work with some issues, not only hack, but also the CAG, which is cache generator, which is, especially in the case to bills that have already gone through, because there won't be any updated information. It will be indexed in the database of the AI. It becomes part of AI. It doesn't have to seek that information. It's part of the direct content. So we have over 30 parliaments with this, and jurisprudence, and in this case of the reinforcement layering, we compare what was generated with what became the final part, and then we can identify if there was a mistake or an improvement of what was generated by AI. But then we go into issues of feedback. People are not saying if they liked or not, or what is wrong. We're not talking about a chat. When we send it to a commission or to legal teams, they start to work on a report. It takes some time to do an analysis of jurisprudence or laws, and it suggests when the prosecutor or the other will give their report. And so in that draft, you can alter and use other chat tools from that basic text. So with that, we reduced. We're not giving it a prompt for it to type what he wanted. We have a pre-prompt in order to reduce mistakes. Also, we're using MCP with the access in real time with APIs. We don't use the traditional tools for vectorial search, a menu search, or a key word, because it will seek synonyms, so it will be able to have better precision to find information. But when I want to know a law bill number X or Y, an API is better than using hack. So we have to have this difference, not because not everything in AI is just you can use it directly. The agents, and there's an improvement of technologies, and with reasoning, they have the ability to think and they simulate how human thinking works. This has reduced this risk. It breaks the task step by step, and it validates that thinking throughout the answer. And people who had with AI in the past, I think you should try once more the Chat GPT, the Page GPT, the Thinking 2.0. You'll see a brutal difference of what was responses in the past to what is now.
And another issue here is also the ifs, which was what João Lima mentioned, which would be having an orchestrator. If this situation happened, you do this. So going back to a little bit of philosophy, just to conclude, I believe we're going to have an impasse that's going to happen with AIs, which is the population wants ready answers. They no longer do Google searches. And based on that, they form their opinion on a topic. So we need to understand that and see if we want the citizen to just consume answers or if we want them to understand the legislative process. Misinformation and lack of context can become a real problem. AI can be a powerful teaching tool to explain deadlines, changes in status, and this brings the citizen closer to the real process. But it needs to respect an institutional ritual and not create certainty where there is uncertainty. Not everything is yes or no, especially in the legislative process. And for MIT, the responsible use of AI is a pact where it gains scale, but it takes on the duty of traceability and caution. And I will conclude with a quote: hack is one type of fuel, AI is the engine, governance is the direction. Without direction, we will get faster to the wrong place. That's it. Thank you. Thank you, Bruno. And after that, I won't dare to say anything else. Thank you, Sara Fernandes, Daniel Schuman, my dear friend Ludovic Delepine, João Lima, Bruno Thomasi, for this exceptional discussion. It's been an honor to moderate this panel and to learn from you. Thank you very much, and I will give it back to Ludmila to continue with our program.